Amen. All right, open up to Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. Romans 8. Well, thought that was going to work. Didn't work. So, all right. I got the hold on a minute sign back there. So, there it is, Romans chapter 8. So, we have been building essentially Paul's case, which is you people are awful. All of you people are awful. That's essentially the case he has built. And made argument after argument after argument to prove that point, that we are all sinners and fall short of the glory of God, and there is nothing we can use by our own power to justify ourselves, whether that be the old law, association, heritage, circumcision, having some great person in your past, all of those types of things are all thrown off the table, to the point to where he even argues that we are sinners even before we know we are sinners. And so he has essentially made the case that we are all wretched people, and particularly there for the Jews, they, even those who are trying to justify themselves by the law itself revealed the fact that they are wretched people. And that brings us to the end of chapter 7, which he basically makes that great exclamation, "Wretched man, who will save me?" And what's the answer? Who saves? Good. I'm glad Randy could say that with confidence. We know the answer to that, right? Saved by Jesus. So that is an awesome thing. And so we moved into chapter 8 on Sunday and started talking about this whole contrast between life and spirit, law versus the spirit of the law, flesh, sin, all these types of things that he is essentially wrapping up his case here and transitioning into what it is that saves us. And that's where we're going to spend a lot of our time for the rest of chapter 8. And so he is building that case. And so what we have here is an introduction that we are saved by Christ, and we are saved by the indwelling of the Father. If you'll notice right here at the end of our section, it talks about the idea of Christ who is in you. That's there in verse 10. There's a place where it talks about God being in you. I'm looking for that. I can't. There, the Spirit of God lives in you in 9. And then verse 11, through his Spirit who lives in you. And so you've got all three of these ideas of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit all dwelling in you. And what all is included with that idea. We'll be talking about that more moving forward. So, what I want you to do is put yourself into the shoes of the original readers of the book of Romans. We know enough about Roman culture, right? We studied that last quarter as we went through the book of Acts. We know enough about Roman culture. We know enough about the way they would have thought, the kind of world that they lived in, the idolatry they were surrounded by, the Jews, how atrocious they found all these other cultures, and how exalted they viewed themselves because of the law and because of their heritage and because of their circumcision and all of those types of things. You're reading this letter or having this letter read out loud to you, which is probably the case for most of them. What are you feeling at this point? Yeah, the whole thing. Like you've sat there for however long it has taken for somebody to read this. So let's say you've been sitting there for 40, 45 minutes, and you've been listening to these words, and again, put yourself in their shoes. You've received a letter from Paul. Like, how exciting is that? The apostle has written us a letter, and he starts the letter off with all of these complimentary statements, and now we're about 40, 45 minutes into the reading of this letter. How are you feeling? Other than exhausted, how are you feeling listening to this letter? Marshall?
I think that if a Jew had grown up Paul, that mindset that Jews had, that I would be arguing with Paul.
Okay.
Because this is exactly opposite of what I've been taught all my life.
Okay. Even if you're not arguing out loud, right. wait. You know, you're still inside arguing with Paul. But how does that make you feel? Like, are you fuming? Are you confused? You know, questioning things? Are you questioning yourself, your heritage? Or are you questioning Paul and his understanding of things? I mean, you got to remember, Paul's not been here before. So some of the Christians know Paul. Probably all of the Christians know the reputation or the name of Paul, but they might not know Paul personally. And so you've received this letter that has these statements okay. So Chris, did you have your hand up? No? Okay. John, or pen?
Mostly possible, like main emotions would be anger or like you said, confusion. Because either, like my dad said, you've grown up with this mindset, this the way you've been created almost, like as a person, your entire life. Who is this guy that can send us a letter telling us how awful we are and what we're doing wrong and all this, and challenge my fundamental beliefs? Like when someone challenges your fundamental beliefs, it's rare, if not impossible, for someone to just immediately accept that. No, that's right. It's either confusion and doubt of your fundamental beliefs and you're working through it, or it's anger because why is this person challenging something that I know is right?
Okay. Okay. Chris?
I would have a lot of questions. For one, there's a lot of possibly new information here that they haven't considered before.
Yeah.
So I would have to be going, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I've not considered that before. Even if you're, I would think from the standpoint of being a Christian Jew or Gentile, you've settled that in your mind. You know that Christ is the way.
Mm-hmm.
This is just new information to either support you or change your ideas about it. But I think it'd be arousing to me, not from a defensive posture, but a curious posture.
Okay. Okay. Keith?
And also, I think there's a lot of things that probably they kind of get the hint, and they see what he's talking about, because he uses a lot of things that would be pretty familiar with them. I mentioned about the slavery, bondage, things like that, and these would be Christians, usually Christians, that knew that they were, their sin was forgiven, sins were forgiven whenever they were baptized, and so they were no longer in bondage. It's the same thing that happened when they came out of Egypt.
Yeah.
Also in chapter 7, verse 2, he talks about a woman that she marries another man, she'll be called an adulteress, but if he dies, then she remarries again, and it'll be okay. And I don't know if this struck them or if they ever had private talks if this didn't come up, but God called them adulteresses in the Old Testament many times. And he said he divorced them. And so we're talking about now, okay, now she can marry again. She can enter into a covenant with another person, another man, and it was kind of fit right what he's talking about. You were under the old law, you were adulterous, but there was a death, and now you are able to follow this new law.
Okay. Well, and again, there's no right or wrong answer to this question. Like it's one of those. I always try to read a text and put myself into the context of the original reader and think, what would I have thought? What would have been my reaction? What emotional response would I have had to this? Would it have created more anger or more curiosity? When you have a letter like the book of Romans, and you have this confrontation, but the confrontation is so logical. But even within the logic that Paul is using in this letter, he is making arguments that are somewhat different than the arguments we would expect him to make like him making the argument about you dying to the law, not the law itself dying. Like that is a strange way to argue that. But logically it follows with everything else Paul is saying. And I'm listening to all of this and seeing how it all fits together. So I'm having a hard time arguing against Paul, other than I just don't like what he's saying, if that's my response. But I'm still wanting to probably myself take a step back and go, we're going to have to read this again. Like, this is not a one-time read type exposure to these ideas, because like we said, there were a lot of new ideas presented here, maybe ideas and arguments they'd not heard before. And up until this point, I mean, here, remember, we're probably 40, 45 minutes into the public reading of this letter. Have the arguments been more positive or negative? Do what? Negative. I would argue negative. It's all been, you're wrong, you're a sinner, you're wrong, you're a sinner, you're wrong, you're a sinner. Right? Like, everything you've ever justified yourself, throw it out, put it in the trash can, and start over, because you are a reprobate sinner that is helpless, sinner, enemy of God. Like, everything that's been argued has just been, for lack of better terms, a slap in the face of anybody who has felt justified by any other measure. Okay, so I'm listening to this, and we've seen the Jewish response to other sermons before, right? Like, they tend to be a fairly emotional people. Wouldn't you agree with that statement? I mean, that let's stone him. That's kind of where they normally go with this, and so you've got this very emotional response. And what I love about chapter 8 is that chapter 8 is kind of the door opening to, okay, now that we've taken everything off the table, let me lay out all the positive possibilities that are available for those who will put their trust in Jesus. And this is probably the point where, if I'm, again, putting myself into the shoes of the original listener, and I've listened to 40 minutes of, you are hopeless. And then all of a sudden, I'm probably at the point where I feel kind of hopeless if I'm taking Paul at his word. And all of a sudden, he starts laying down layer after layer of, here's all the good things about being in Jesus. It's gonna hit home, right? It's really, it is masterfully written to essentially knock you down, rub your face in the dirt, and then say, all right, now let's go. We got some good stuff to look at. Like that is kind of the direction the letter takes. Ben? Oh, yeah. 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 And that's exactly what chapter 8 is. Chapter 8 is the victory song at the end of a very difficult movie. Right? That's maybe a good way to view this. Chapter 8 kind of brings us to that victory march. And then there's more to go. You come to chapter 9, and there's some more logical arguments and things like that. But it's interesting to see the way this forms. Dallas? Yeah. 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 Well, and essentially what it does is it takes a group of people who seemingly We don't know much about the church at Rome other than the few little pictures we have, which are the book of Romans and a brief mention of Paul being in Rome. And we know some things from secular history, but from a biblical perspective, that's about all we know. So we don't really know a lot about the people at Rome and things like that. My suspicion is, based on how long we know the church has been there, and we talked about that at the beginning of our quarter. It's been there for several decades by the time that Paul is writing this letter. My suspicion is, again, remember, the Jews were the prominent people in the church in the beginning. Then the Jews were expelled from the city, which allowed the Gentiles to be the prominent people within the church. And then the Jews were allowed back in, which returned this Jewish presence to the church. And there's probably, we don't know, but you can imagine probably some sort of power struggle based on how they're going to do things, because they both have different ideas on how they're going to do things. And there's probably a lot of conflicts based on culture and based on those types of things. Probably. We don't know. All of that is assumption. And I always, like I say, I always try to share with you when I'm assuming versus when we know something clearly out of the text. But based on those assumptions, it's not hard to see why there is conflict between the Jews justifying themselves based on their heritage, based on their circumcision, based on their law, based on all those things. And Paul is essentially, again, like we've said over and over, putting them all in the same boat. You are all hopelessly lost without Jesus. No. Stop arguing. You're all hopelessly lost without Jesus. No. That argument doesn't work either. You're all hopelessly lost without Jesus. Like, that's what he keeps coming back to. So that when they finally go, okay, fine, he can say, now let me show you all the hope you have in Jesus. And that's what chapter 8 is. That's the great thing about it. Dallas? Yes. Yeah. Sanctified, you were justified. Yeah, exactly right. And that, again, there is a strength that comes from realizing our hopelessness without Jesus. And that was true for the Jews in Rome, particularly. That was true of the Gentiles in Corinth, as Dallas has pointed out. That's true of us. And there's a strength that comes from, it's like Paul revealed God's words to him whenever he asked for the removal of the thorn of the flesh back in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Why did God refuse to remove the thorn in the flesh? And my grace is sufficient. And what he gives another explanation. My strength is made perfect or displayed through weakness. And that's what 1 Corinthians 1 begins with. This idea of the weakness of God is stronger than the strength of men. And the wisdom of God, the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of men. That when we realize just how worthless we are, and that our worth comes from being in Jesus, that's powerful. And we need to let that hit home. And that I think is entirely the point of what Paul has been doing here in the book of Romans thus far, helping us all realize our worthlessness unless we have Jesus. It is by having, as it says in verse 9, 10, and 11, having the Spirit of God in you, Christ in you, the Spirit of him in you, that's what makes you something. And we need to recognize that and hold on to that. And that's a big part of this. So, all right, let's move on to the next section. Chapter 8, verse 12 through 17. Somebody read this, one of my favorite passages from Romans.
So then, brothers and sisters, we are not obligated to the flesh to live according to the flesh. you live, unless you are going to die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. All those led by God's Spirit are God's sons. For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear. Instead, you received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit itself testifies together with our spirit that we are God's children, and if God's children, also heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if, indeed, we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him.
Okay, there is a lot packed into this small little section. I think we'll finish it tonight, but a lot packed into this, and it is all worth dwelling on. And obviously that's always true of every section of Scripture, but the pieces that are here bring in so many different elements for us to discuss and to realize the value of belonging to Jesus. So let's kind of break it down little bit by little bit. Before we do, though, what keys, connections, contrast, and all of that you find in this section? Okay, so it continues on this contrast between spirit and flesh. Okay. Okay, interestingly, we have a redefining of what it means to be an heir. Okay, and especially for the Jews, that would have been particularly powerful. We're going to come back and talk about that. What else? Okay, so family, right? You are God's son, adoption, children, heirs, brothers and sisters, all of those family connections in there that allow us to see a reality of being a part of God's people. Anything else? Okay, slavery versus adoption. That is an interesting contrast. Okay, and there are a couple of things in the greater context of Romans to discuss on that. So, good thing to, that's a good find. Keith? Okay, so you've got the, hadn't thought about that one, so that's an interesting one. I'm going to have to mull over that one while we're talking about some things. Anything else? All right, so let's kind of break this down piece by piece, and y'all pointed out a lot of the really interesting promises or blessings that come from this section. So first of all, we're not obligated to live according to the flesh. What does that mean? Okay, Marshall? That's your fault. Wait, that's his fault. Sorry, that's the, yeah. Assume we said it all.
The flesh, the way I interpret it, 7 and 8, the flesh is a reference to the law,
Mm-hmm.
trying to eliminate the law versus the spirit.
Mm-hmm.
So, while there may be some other applications there, I think that would be the primary thing is that they're not underneath that anymore. They're not going to live by that. If they try to live by that, they're dead. There's no hope.
Yeah, so again, you consider all of the things we've talked about thus far. Paul essentially makes a bit of a summary statement here at the beginning of this section. Okay? We are not obligated to the flesh. Well, the law has already been equated to the flesh. Pursuing the law is the same thing as pursuing the flesh, those types of things. The end result of pursuing the law was what? Death. The end result of living according to the flesh is death. So, I mean, essentially what Paul is doing is he is pulling all of that forward and saying, now that we have clarified the law's off the table, where do we go from here? That's kind of how I would reword this beginning section. Dallas? Okay. Yeah. So that, now that we've said all of this, here's where that leaves us, and that therefore, so then, that's what it's there for. Is to help us draw that connection. So, but if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. Now again, that brings in back, remember at the beginning of chapter 6, where it talks about the idea of if you are in Christ, you are no longer alive to sin, but you are dead to sin. Because the old man is gone and the new man has risen, and the new man has not been risen for the purpose of sin. He's been risen to walk in newness of life. So you've got that, if you're not pursuing the flesh and you've died and that old man is gone and you are walking by the Spirit, walking in this newness of life, you put to death all the deeds of the body, all of those sins, all the pursuits of the law, all of that stuff is gone, you will live. That's where we're at. Okay? So one of the greatest blessings of everybody being in the same boat and everybody being justified by Jesus or rescued by Jesus, because there's no condemnation for those who are now in Christ Jesus, right? Which again deals with the law. But that idea, now that we're all there, what's the blessing? Life. That's the blessing. That's the first blessing that Paul really talks about here. What does that mean? One thing to say, the blessing is life. It's another thing to understand it. What's being promised there? Okay? Okay, so part of life is the community or the family you become a part of. Okay. They didn't have the same sense of, or the same development of concept, no. Well, but again, that is one of the blessings, and we're going to talk about that. He does move into that. So yes, I do think that's included. The afterlife or the eternal life that we gain. Anything else? This makes me think of one of Jesus's promises, right? I have come that you may have life and have it abundantly. What does that mean? Yeah, I mean, and again, I don't think this means he's going to make us all millionaires and that we're going to have this incredible life based on human standards. This is saying God has gifted us the opportunity, when we get to be risen to walk in newness of life, we get to be risen to walk according to the Spirit. We get to put aside all of the old man, all the guilt that goes with the old man, all of the difficulties that went with life as the old man, and we get to walk a new life with Christ. That's a good life. Yeah. I mean, honestly, we end up destroying ourselves, pursuing what we think is good, and God's over there going, okay, I've got all this figured out. Live this way and things will be good. I was having a counseling session with a gentleman today, and he has a wreck of a life. Just all sorts of issues. A lot of it stems back to some issues that happened when he was a kid. Obviously, I don't want to get into any sort of specifics. But I made the argument with him because we were talking about how to move forward and what kind of changes need to happen, and that you can't necessarily control your circumstances. You can't control what other people do and how they treat you, but you can change today and thereby change your future, right? And honestly, I'm trying to set up that thought process that would lead him to making the greatest change, okay? But one of the things I said is, he was talking about how a friend of his had said, well, go, if there was anything you could change about your past, what would it be? And we were talking about how ridiculous that whole discussion is because you can't change anything in your past. And kind of the trendy thing to say is, oh, I wouldn't change anything because if anything were different, I wouldn't be the person I am today. Well, for some of us, that's not necessarily a bad road to go down. But it's, what is the argument? I said, okay, so we obviously know that can't happen. But let's compare that to our will versus God's will. If I could go back and live God's will perfectly, would I have the problems I have today? No. I mean, and this, well, in many cases, I won't get into, again, the specifics of this one, but divorce, I have these kind of conversations surrounding divorce or surrounding addictions or surrounding broken relationships, okay? If I were to go back and do everything the way God says I should do it, would I have all the difficulties that I have today? The odds are no. And my follow-up comment with him was, okay, so if we start doing everything God's way now, what does the future look like? A lot better, right? A lot better than us doing it our own way. And that, I think, is part of what we have going on here with this whole argument of old man versus new man and following the flesh versus following the spirit and those types of things is, if we, by the Spirit, put to death the deeds of the body, you gain life. You will live. If I put aside all the mess and start living for God now, I have life abundantly. Isn't that logical? And isn't that a great blessing? Chris? But suffering for Christ is very different than suffering for sin. And that's where, again, the big difference is. I don't carry guilt when I suffer for doing right. I carry the ability to boast in the Lord when I suffer for doing right. So that doesn't mean if I do everything God's way that I'm going to be the millionaire and have that Tesla that I'm driving around and have a perfect family and my children are all going to make perfect decisions. And that's all human standard stuff. But if I live according to Christ's way, I will have life abundantly. That I don't think we can argue with. And that to me is the difference. Penn? Yeah. Nope. Yeah, it means lack of guilt, lack of my difficulties will change. I will at least put it that way. Okay. So we keep going. For all those led by God's Spirit are God's sons. What's the blessing here? Do what? Yeah. Belonging to God. And not just belonging to God, but belonging to God in an intimate and personal way. You become the children of God. That is a huge blessing, isn't it? Now, what's interesting about that is, and again, you can kind of go back and forth on this particular one, but the Jews did not typically describe themselves as God's children. They were the children of Israel. They were, Israel was married to God in a sense, but they didn't just, they would describe themselves as the people of God, but very rarely did that, that was not the common go-to understanding of their relationship with God. Not like it is for us as Christians. We talk about that very nonchalantly. We're children of God. Okay? That would have been a somewhat foreign concept. For Jesus to call himself the Son of God, what was their response to that? No, you can't do that. And what did Jesus respond to that on one time? We're all God's children. But that was an uncommon way to refer to themselves. And you see that in the reaction that the Jews had to Jesus having that idea. And so just this idea of elevating the relationship you can have with God is huge. This idea of being God's son. Now, for the Greeks, how would this have been maybe possibly interpreted? Do what? Demigods, exalted people. There's a kind of a, the sons of God. That oftentimes was a declaration of the emperor himself, that he was one of the God's sons. And those types of things. I don't know that would have been their go-to understanding here, but the idea of being God's sons was clearly a very special designation. And so for Paul to use that description here, you are God's son. Then he goes on to explain that. And the explanation of that is somewhat interesting because it kind of argues a little bit with some of the stuff he says earlier in the letter. Remember back in chapter 6, he talks about you are either a slave of sin or a slave of God. Here, he moves into something a little different. For if you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, instead you received a spirit of adoption by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. And so, again, I don't know that he is contradicting himself as much as he is helping them see we are more than slaves of God. Our relationship is more than servant to master. Our relationship is son to father. So he is escalating the blessing. Does that make sense? Everybody with me, Dallas? Yes. Yeah. It's like daddy is really the concept. Now again, it drives me nuts when people pray, oh daddy, in prayer. That's a personal thing. I can't say it's wrong to do that because of this passage. But this idea of having a very intimate, personal relationship with God that is based not on merely whom you serve, but this one is based on whom has adopted you. It's based on relationship. That is an incredible escalation of blessing. And I hope we get that, because again, we use this expression so nonchalantly that I don't know that we really let it sink in. Go ahead, Marshall. Oh, I was just going to say, so the other day I kind of got made fun of because Scott mentioned my podcast on Sunday. And somebody had come to our house and they said, "Yeah, we saw your dad over the weekend." She said, I asked him if he was going to be on your podcast, because I interview somebody once a week. And my dad was like, "No, probably not. He's never going to call me for that." So when I heard that, I called my dad and I made fun of him a little bit. But what I told my dad is this. I said, "Dad," I said, "you're on my list, but you were on my list when I'm in a pinch." I said, "Because I know you will bend over backwards to make something happen if I need it to happen, and none of these other people would." Right? That's how dads work. Dads are there for you no matter what, because they love you, and it's a personal relationship, and it's intimate, and they're going to help you when nobody else is going to help you. Right? That is not a master-slave relationship. That is a personal, loving relationship, and there's a big difference there. And I don't know that we let it sink in that we have that kind of personal connection with the creator of the universe. It's incredible, the gift we have. And to have him on our side, to have him welcoming us home whenever our time here is over. And not again, it's not all right, well, if you go through the right channels, you can get an audience with the king. Like that. That's not the relationship we're guaranteed. We're guaranteed unfettered access to our Father. And that is, I don't know how we let that become trivial. We do, myself included there, but we shouldn't. I mean, I get onto myself for this, how our prayers can become rote. You know, I've never had a rote conversation with my dad. Ever. Whenever I get to talk to my dad, it is a genuine conversation every time. How about you? But with my dad, my father, how many times have I found myself saying things without meaning them, saying them because it's what I'm used to saying them because it is automatic, saying them because it's what sounds right, whether it's genuine or not? How many times have I let it become about service instead of about relationship? I think we need to be really cautious about this. And not necessarily because he'd get mad at you for it, but because we're losing opportunities to speak to our Father. And I love the way Paul says there, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. By whom we cry out in the most personal terms, Dad, I need you. And that's just such an incredible blessing. And something I too often let become trivial. Any thoughts, questions? Just Chris?
Something came to mind that I heard recently back in Deuteronomy chapter 1. The people, the Israelites, should have been familiar with the concept of God being their Father. It says in chapter 1, verse 31, when they're recounting their history, "You saw in the wilderness how the Lord your God carried you as a man carries his son all along the way he traveled until he reached this place." So that concept should have been in their mind whether they wanted it to be in their mind. Moses tried to plant that in them to see that. The difference with that, and to me there's a difference because you got two different groups here, Jews and Gentiles. And the Jews should have had that concept in their mind. Gentiles not so much. But I think it would have more of an impact on them to understand that.
Maybe so.
although there's suffering in that relationship, if you follow God, there's all things that work together for the good.
Mhm.
That's a big deal. That should hopefully get you something.
Yeah. Ben? Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, God has never promised to respond to ritual. God promised to respond to sacrifices, but the sacrifices were designed to, ideally, get them to reconnect to a God who was, their judge, and those types of things. And again, it's like the Israelites should have known, how often is it through the Old Testament where God is presented in very personal tones, whether it be the father carrying them through the wilderness, being the husband, the dutiful husband who is welcoming his adulterous wife back, the bird who shelters her little chicklings under her wings. You've got all of these beautiful descriptions. The potter who is making the clay. I mean, we can come up with all of these very beautiful descriptions of God, and yet they let God become a distant God who responds to rituals. And we do the same thing. I mean, how many of us have sang and not had a clue what we just sang? Yeah. I mean, how many of us have prayed, don't have a clue what we prayed about? How many of us have heard or dug into God's word, but just kind of zoomed through it because you were supposed to be in God's word and don't have a clue what you just read later on? How many of us have, and we could just go to thing after thing after thing where we do rituals, maybe not to the same degree that the Israelites did, but how many of us have taken the bread and the juice on a Sunday and our brain is on something entirely different than Jesus? I mean, it is so easy to fall into the practice of distancing ourselves from God. And honestly, the way I view that is this. I lied a little bit ago. I said I've never had a rote conversation with my dad. That's not true. I have. I remember my teenage years when it was, yeah, whatever, right? I mean, those difficult teenage years. Well, I wasn't really caring about my relationship with my dad. He was there. He'd be there when I needed him, but he could stay over there until I needed him. And honestly, that's how we treat God sometimes. We're like rebellious teenagers who are still living in the house because it's convenient, instead of being truly devoted children who appreciate a God who loves us so much that he does amazing things for us. And we'll talk more about that on Sunday. So thank you. We'll